Hello, thank you for joining me for my third video on channel Catfish. This one I'm going to be talking about nutrition and feeding. So I give you my little introduction and then we'll get started. I showed a version of this map in part one, and what we see here then is that the main catfish farming states of Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Uh, Louisiana doesn't do very much. The top three then are Mississippi with production of around 85,000 metric tons. About 57% of this 149,000 metric tons produced in these three states. And then we have Alabama with around 43.6 thousand metric tons, and then Arkansas with much less at 5%. Now, as I said in my introduction, the first part here, I want to talk a little bit about the history of catfish feed in the USA. And to do that, there are some very good retrospective articles, and I will be covering several of them in this presentation. The first one that I want to mention is this channel Catfish, Ictalurus punctatus, Nutrition in the United States, historical perspective. I found this article to be very interesting. It's from 2019, so relatively recent, and there you see the QR code, so you can go and find this paper. It's free to download. So prior to the start of channel catfish nutrition research in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, catfish farming relied on pond fertilization to boost natural pond productivity. And as I mentioned in part one, at that time, channel catfish was being grown mainly as a, not as a bait fish, but being grown as a sport fish. And it wasn't until really in the 70s that it became food fish. So in those days, they did not know anything about nutrition, and they were just using whatever they had available that they thought would be suitable. And so we have some examples here from this paper by Robinson and Lee of some of the early feeds that were being used. So cooked cornmeal and freshwater mussels, minced goldfish and liver. Now I assume that's beef liver. And then the first published feed formula from 1947 for catfish consisted of 50% crayfish abdomens. Those are freshwater crayfish. And then if they did not have crayfish, they would use beef spleen and liver instead. These early feed formula also included 16.7% fish meal, cottonseed meal, and also dried skim milk. So they're just using locally available ingredients from that time, and basically it's more or less still the same today. Now, I've gone back and I've looked for some of the old papers. These papers, there's a couple of them here, they were actually technical documents prepared by the government office, and they have been scanned and digitized by Google. And so if you go to that QR code, it will open Google, where you can download this paper. And so this one by Harry Dupree and Kermit Sneed was talking about the response of channel catfish fingerlings to different levels of major nutrients in purified diets. So we're talking about purified diets. And this was about the time that Dr. Halver's diets were introduced. I will be bringing that up in a moment. But look at the ingredients and the feeding schedule for this particular trial that they were doing. So they were using two main components. One, a 41% crude protein rainbow trout pelleted feed. This is before extrusion. Extrusion for fish feed did not start until about the mid 1980s. And they were feeding this at 3.5% body weight per day on Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturday, and Sunday. Now, this is a feed for rainbow trout. Even in those days, we didn't know much about the nutrient requirements of rainbow trout either. And then on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, they were feeding fresh beef liver at 8% body weight per day because it was wet liver. And then you see their data analysis for these two ingredients. So the pellet had 41% protein, fat not less than 7. And then they had analyzed the beef liver, 19.7% protein, 3.2% fat. Now, the thing is, without the beef liver, they would not have been able to obtain many of the vitamins, such as vitamin B12, because in these days we didn't really yet know anything about the nutrient requirements of channel catfish. The first open catfish feed formula, that is a formula that could be used with typical feed ingredients that were locally available, came from Auburn University in 1957. So this they simply called Auburn number 1, and it had 42% crude protein. It was 35% soybean meal, 35% peanut meal, and I'm assuming that's whole peanuts, and then 15% fish meal, and 15% distillers dried solubles. So that would have been probably from whiskey production. And then a little bit later, they modified that formula slightly, and they simply called that Auburn number 2. Now, the difference here was that the protein came up from 42% to 46%, and the fiber was reduced. And I'm assuming what they did now was, instead of using whole peanuts, which included the shells, they then started using peanut cake, which was the byproduct or the co-product from production of peanut oil. And there's a lot of that in states like Georgia and elsewhere in the U.S. Southeastern states. Here's a paper a little bit later from 1973, a preliminary evaluation of a fish diet based on roasted soybeans and fresh fish. So here we are, two experimental diets, one consisting of 50% roasted soybeans and 50% fresh fish, and another one consisting of 30% soybeans, 20% corn meal, and 50% fresh fish. So these were probably not even pelleted. These would have been extruded through a mincer or something like that, producing a wet noodle. Because of this high fresh fish content, it would have been wet. And then they also added vitamin and mineral supplements, and they were comparing this with Oregon pellets. Now, here they're referring to Oregon moist pellets, and Oregon moist pellets were the preferred feed, really the only feed at the time that was being used for production of trout and salmon in the Pacific Northwest and the states of Oregon and Washington State. And at the time, that was the also a wet frozen feed pellet, and it was growing trout and salmon fairly well. So they did this comparison, but you see here, even in a paper that was published in 1973, and this was coming from Southern Illinois University, they were still not really able to produce any kind of a commercially convenient feed that could be used in farms. Okay, let's talk a moment about the father of fish nutrition. I had the privilege of being a student, the final PhD student of Dr. John Halver before he retired. I was at the University of Washington from 1982 to 1992. And so Dr. Halver was famous because he began to develop scientific methods to study rainbow trout and salmon nutrition in the late 1950s and early 1960s. If you search for him, you will find some history of biography about him. And he actually, after the Second World War, he studied medical biochemistry. So he was coming from that perspective and then got invited to start looking at the nutrition of fish. So he just brought his already known techniques over to fish nutrition. And we have to be very thankful for that, because otherwise we really would not have had such an early beginning in fish nutrition and aquaculture, in fact. So he first investigated vitamin and amino acid requirements of rainbow trout. But really, the key thing here was he began to develop these techniques, and he was widely sharing these techniques. His work generated widespread interest in using these methods with other species, including channel catfish. And in 1972, he published the first edition of his book called Fish Nutrition. This was really, in those days, the only book that was available. And I list there the contributors. And the only contributor that was involved with catfish in the U.S. Southeast at the time was W.H. Hastings. So he was here as one of the contributors to this volume. And let's talk about the father of catfish nutrition. So that happened to be Dr. Tom Lovell. And in 1969, he moved to Auburn University and he set up the first warm water fish nutrition research program. And so that was when he started. Now, he's also known for publishing two books before his retirement. We have in 1989 the first edition of Nutrition and Feeding of Fish. This one I think is quite easy to find around on the internet. I think at the end of my presentation here today, I will have a QR code. You can go and look for that. And then he came up with a second edition in 1998. Going back now to this historical perspective. So early research in catfish nutrition was conducted at universities and government facilities and institutions in Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas A&M, Texas A&M University, and Kansas State College, now Kansas State University. And so we had, in this case, if you're looking here at the table on the right-hand side, this was from Robert Wilson. He was at Mississippi State University. He specialized in the amino acid requirements of channel catfish. But looking at his purified diet that he published in his book in 1981, very similar to what Dr. Halver was doing. So main ingredients were for protein were casein and gelatin, and dextrin was a source of energy and carbohydrates. Cellulose was a filler. And then we had corn oil, cod liver oil, vitamins, minerals, and so on. And I haven't looked deeply into these mineral and vitamin mixes, but I suspect that they're probably borrowed from Dr. Halver. Dr. Halver's second edition of Fish Nutrition came out in 1989, and this was during the period when I was at the University of Washington, and I actually helped him to prepare all of the tables and graphs and so on that were in the back of the book. And this is actually a scan of the inside page of my own personal copy where Dr. Halver had signed it. And now we have a list of contributors that is much longer because the book now has generated a lot of widespread interest and has gone all over the world. And among these contributors, now we have Richard Lovell there. So that was from Auburn University. And down at the bottom, we have Robert Wilson from Mississippi State University. Dr. Halver's first real contribution to fish nutrition was the development of his H440 purified test diet. And he published this paper in 1957 called A Vitamin Test Diet for Long-Term Feeding Studies. If we look at the table in the first column, we see the main ingredients: vitamin-free casein, very important that it be vitamin-free, and purified gelatin. These would typically be bought from a scientific supply store. They were not typical ingredients. These were research ingredients. And then purified corn oil and cod liver oil, dextrin, and then he had a mineral mixture. You can see the composition of the mineral mixture in the second column, and then he had a vitamin supplement, and you can see the composition of the vitamin supplement in the third column. Now, in order to prove the validity of his concept and to validate the performance of this diet, he had here, you see in this table, a comparison of the growth of rainbow trout fed freshly ground beef liver and rainbow trout fed the complete vitamin test diet. So at the time, beef liver was considered really the best feed ingredient for a carnivorous fish. And he shows here that when he fed the liver and when he fed his H440 diet, that in fact the growth performance was the same, in suggesting that the diet was nutritionally complete. Now, this feed, when you made it, it was a liquid that you poured out into dishes, and it hardened. And due to the vitamins, especially the riboflavin, this was like a hard jelly that was actually yellow in color. And then you would take this and you would either put it through a mincer to make kind of like little noodles from it, and or you could even use a shredder, similar to what you would use to shred a carrot or a potato, and then you would feed the fish in this way. Keep this in the refrigerator, and you could also freeze this so you could make a large lot and then bring it out as you needed it to use. Here we have another paper from a government report on the vitamins essential for growth of channel catfish. So Dr. Dupree used Halver's H440 diet with minor modifications, and then he published his paper. So once again, you have to go to Google and you can download the document that they digitized. And so Dr. Dupree said that the vitamins that he determined were required was B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, B9, and B12. And we have a graph here showing B6. So when you feed the complete diet, this is the growth curve that you get. And then when you feed the deficient diet, or the diet that has all vitamins in it except biotin, then the fish grow a little bit until they deplete the stored supply of biotin. Now, keep in mind that B vitamins are generally stored in very low quantities in the body, and any excesses are typically excreted rapidly. Nevertheless, some was in the tissues, and the animals grew a little bit. It looks like that's 3, 4, 5, maybe 5 weeks, and then the growth rate starts to drop down. And then if you just keep them on that biotin pyridoxine So here's a paper, once again, a government report available from Google, where Dr. Dupree used Dr. Halver's H440 diet with minor modifications, and then he published the first paper reporting the qualitative requirements for water-soluble vitamins. So a qualitative requirement is it needed or not needed? Yes or no? And based on the results of this experimentation, he said that vitamin B1, B2, B3, B5, B6, B9, and B12 were required. And we have this graphic relating to B6 pyridoxine. So when the diet contained pyridoxine and it was a full vitamin supplementation, the fish grew like that. When you fed them the pyridoxine deficient diet, they grew up for about 4 weeks. Once the tissue supplies were depleted in the liver and elsewhere, then the fish stopped growing and actually started to lose weight. Now, B vitamins are water-soluble vitamins. They tend to be stored in small quantities, and any excesses are typically excreted very rapidly. So unlike fat-soluble vitamins, they're not stored in the body in large quantities. So we have then the growth dropping. Now, if partway through the experiment, then the animals were put back on the diet containing pyridoxine, then the growth recovered, as you can see here. So this kind of an experiment shows us that without pyridoxine, fish will not grow. So that proves it is a required one. Whereas on the other hand, over here with inositol, he said, not required. We had biotin. Now, he didn't believe that his result was accurate. He gave a warning. He said, well, I got this result, but I don't actually believe it because we know from other animals that biotin is absolutely required. So I made a mistake, but okay, I'm just letting you know, and don't believe this result too much. But also not required, then he had inositol, choline, ascorbic acid, and this is PABA. So this was para-aminobenzoic acid. Now, curiously, he said no ascorbic acid was needed. Well, of course, that is absolutely required. So we don't know quite why he got that result. However, we just saw what happened with the pyridoxine. Let's look at the inositol. So whether you feed them a diet with inositol or deficient in inositol, the growth did not change and there was no mortality. So this indicated that you could leave it out of the diet and the fish grew perfectly fine and there was no mortality. So this was an indication that it was absolutely not required. Here we have the paper that I mentioned before. This was Dr. Dupree's version of the test diet. So he was using casein. Here he had no gelatin in his diet. And then he had vegetable oil, so no fish oil. And then he had dextran and he had his mineral mix, which is shown below, and his vitamin mix, which is shown below, and he added agar because he didn't have gelatin in here. So why he chose this particular combination, it didn't really matter too much. But notice when you're choosing a single ingredient like casein, you are not balancing amino acids similar to what fish meal would look like. Now, okay, so casein is milk protein, so it is an animal protein, but it's not exactly perfect. But nevertheless, he was using this combination. Here we see a paper in collaboration between Dr. Dupree and Dr. Halver from 1970 called, on the upper right there, Amino Acids Essential for the Growth of Channel Catfish, Ictalurus punctata. So now we're basically going beyond that first study that Dr. Dupree did, and the diet is basically more or less the same as what Dr. Dupree had used previously. And there's another graphic over here showing that when you used an amino acid complete diet uh, for let's say essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids, the growth was perfectly fine. Now, when you used a diet where you had, a full control diet with everything versus a diet that was deficient in a particular amino acid, then you would get growth like this. If you put the missing amino acid back in the diet, then the growth would recover like this. So once again, proving yes or no. We're not determining quantities yet. We're not being able to say the quantitative requirements. So according to this, then they stated that indispensable amino acid test diets failed to produce growth when arginine, histidine, leucine, isoleucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, or valine were missing from the ration. Recovery was prompt when missing indispensable amino acid was replaced in the diet. So that's exactly what we're seeing right here. Here's a paper from 1971 from Auburn by Prather and Lovell, Effective Vitamin Fortification in Auburn number 2. So Auburn number 2 was their 46% diet that was based on soy, cottonseed, and dehulled peanut meal. And Dr. Lovell showed that addition of supplemental vitamins improved the growth performance of Auburn number 2. So they had a Auburn number 2 without vitamins. They had an Auburn number 2 with vitamins. And then they had a control feed. So looking over here, what was their control? Well, their control was this diet. And so they had fish meal, blood meal, feather meal, soybean meal, dried fermentation solubles, dehydrated alfalfa meal, and rice bran and corn. And in this case, the vitamin mix was what Hastings and Dupree had used, which was a poultry layer breeder premix. So it was not a vitamin mix that was tuned for catfish. And then in the Auburn number 2, they used this vitamin premix. And so as you can see right here, and the thing is that when they used this new premix in the Auburn number 2, they saw net production increase nearly 40%, indicating the importance of vitamins in catfish feed. So carrying on now a little bit more with the history, the first farmer-owned feed mill opened in 1974 in Isola, Mississippi. Country Skillet, which was a brand of marketed catfish, opened a processing plant there in 1977. And in the industry, we had a combination of cooperative feed mills that were owned by the farmers and then public funded research led by people like Dr. Tom Lovell, which led to the practice of publishing open feed formulas that were not proprietary. And Dr. Lovell was probably the main consultant to all of these feed mills. So the formulas were kept quite up to date with the latest research findings coming from the nutrition researchers in the region. And so this was something that was very good. Of course, there were, commercial producers like Purina, Ralston Purina, and Cargill and other companies like that. But a lot of the large cooperative farming used feeds coming from their own cooperative-owned feed mills. Finally, in 1973, the National Research Council of the United States released this first nutrition guide, Nutrient Requirements of Trout, Salmon, and Catfish, in 1973. And this book, I have a hard copy of it, but fortunately, it's still available from the National Academy of Sciences National Research Council website. if you scan that QR code, you can actually download that. Now, you may have to register first, but if you're coming from a so-called developing country, um, they give you easy access. Now, looking here at the list of the Committee of Animal Nutrition, these were primarily people who were involved in, not just fish farming and fish nutrition, but we see Dr. Halver there on the list. And then we have the subcommittee on fish nutrition, and this was the group that was actually involved in writing this nutrient requirement guide. And we see Charles Deyo from Kentucky, and then also Harry Dupree, who were involved in the writing of the section on channel catfish nutrition. Since then, the National Research Council has published several more editions. So we have 1983 nutrient requirements of warm water fishes and shellfishes. Shellfishes in this case was referring to shrimp farming, which was just getting started with Penaeus monodon. And then in 1993, the focus was on nutrient requirements of fish. And then the most recent one was in 2011. And as you can see, the thickness and size of these volumes got bigger and bigger. And by the time we've reached 2011, there are tables showing, maybe tens of species of fish among which you have to search, but you will still find the data for channel catfish. Okay, let's move on to nutrient requirements. Talk first about protein and essential amino acids. So here we're dealing with a lot of papers that have been written by various government agencies or maybe university extension services. And then, of course, Doctors Robinson and Lee have been involved in many publishing many of their own papers, plus a lot of extension papers as well. So this one, a brief overview of catfish nutrition, and I'm going to be showing you tables from this. There were two editions. The first one was published in 2001, but I'm giving you the QR code for the updated 2015 version. So here we see the essential amino acids. By this time, we now know, according to the work of Dr. Robert Wilson, the actual essential requirements. And then they give you some comments there. Note at the top that they said that recommended level of protein was 26 to 32. The industry more or less was using 28 to 32. 32 more recently has become a little bit more expensive, and the industry has pretty much settled on 28% protein as the standard protein level in catfish grower feeds. Same authors, but a different publication. A summary of catfish nutrition research, and this is involved with the Mississippi State University Extension and then the Delta Western Research Center. Here they're comparing 28% protein without supplement. So the supplement is vitamins, minerals, and fat. And then they had an 18% with and without the supplement. And then they had 10%. Well, all this really proved was that you needed to have a 28% protein diet to get any decent kind of growth. Here you can see we've got the feed consumption, we have the weight gain, we've got the FCR. So at the very low protein level, the FCR was really high relative to today. Everything is still somewhere around 1.6 to 1.8. The top table is from the previous Robinson document on fat. So digestible energy, they give you in kilocalories per gram, lipid 4 to 6%, so relatively low fat level, and carbohydrate level of 25 to 35. Now, floating feed requires at least 25% grain. So this is what they're stating here in the comment. Now, grain, I'm assuming, means corn or wheat, but probably corn. And corn is typically around 70% starch. Dried corn is typically about 70% starch. Wheat is maybe a little bit higher. But with 25%, you're going to get about 20% starch in the feed. And this is what we need for extrusion. To make a good expanding floating feed, we need to have starch about 20%. Now, below, then we have a table taken from Dr. Lovell's second edition of his book, where he's talking about protein and digestible energy requirements by various sizes of channel catfish. So because the fish is growing larger, obviously then the grams of protein required per day at very fast growth when the fish are young, as the growth rate begins to slow down in terms of grams of protein per 100 grams of fish per day, the intake goes down quite substantially. He has the digestible energy, and then he has the ratio between digestible energy and protein, which really does not change much. It actually increases a little bit because the fish are growing less, but they're more active, and so they actually need a slightly higher amount of energy. Amino acid requirements from Lovell's book. So we see here the essential amino acids. He has channel catfish in the first column, and then he's comparing with several other species. So we have rainbow trout, salmon, carp, and Nile tilapia here. A few other papers. One of the things that we're always interested in is, can we reduce protein levels from real ingredients, and can we supplement with crystalline amino acids? And when we're dealing with some of these high plant protein diets, we're very curious primarily about substitution of ingredient lysine with synthetic lysine, and also with methionine. So here's some papers that are talking about this, where they're comparing intact protein and crystalline amino acids. And in the early days, there was some results that suggested, it didn't seem to be working, but as they understood it better and maybe the quality of the products got better, then it turned out that, in fact, we can use supplemental methionine and lysine primarily, but also threonine to improve the growth rate. So here's two papers that are talking about lysine. So the first one actually did not seem to work because this one at Auburn University, this was the growth rate when the feed contained intact protein from ingredients, and this was a much weaker growth rate when synthetic lysine was used. And so that was at 1999. Now, here we have a master's thesis from 2015, and he's showing here the feed with lysine from ingredients, or supplemental lysine from crystalline lysine. The growth rate's almost identical. And probably if you have enough practice and experience, you can actually make the growth rate essentially identical. No difference whatsoever. Regarding essential fatty acids, we have this paper from 2020, Jesse Trushensky, and looking her conclusions. Channel catfish have the desaturase enzymes delta 5 and delta 6, so they can produce EPA, arachidonic acid, DHA from C18 PUFA. So C18 PUFA, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about linoleic acid, C18-1, and alpha-linolenic acid C18-3. And so both these N3 and N6 PUFAs are essential in feeds for channel catfish, but we don't actually really have to feed them, other than we get some, maybe if we still have some fish meal in our diet, and then the animals can make it. Now, I have said many times that when you're dealing with small animals who are very fast growing, I do not suggest relying on this elongation and desaturation, because I think it's it requires a high energy output from the animal, and it's also quite complicated with multiple enzymes. It's a bit slow, and so for very fast growing juveniles, I recommend there should always be some fish oil or fish oil equivalent in order to give them a dietary source, not rely on their ability to make what they need. And then they also included a dietary excess of long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids might have a detrimental effect on fish growth performance, and to meet the physiological demand for 20 carbon 4, which actually is arachidonic acid. Now, arachidonic acid is a essential fatty acid that we, even today, don't really understand exactly what it does, but it is in a pathway that's very important for production of catecholamines and some other enzymes that are oftentimes ending up in pro-inflammatory responses in the tissues of the fish. Signs of vitamin deficiency. So this, once again, is coming from Robert Wilson's book. I haven't shown it to you yet, but I will at the end. And many of these signs are common across all fish species that have been tested. So here we see the fat-soluble vitamins, problems with the eyes, swelling, so on, vitamin D, low bone ash, and then we have the water-soluble vitamins here. And the fact is that the first thing that happens when you have a vitamin deficiency is animals stop eating and you have slow growth. And so unless some of these deficiencies are visible, you can see them like problems with the eyes or body swelling, maybe some behavioral differences. A thiamine deficiency, the fish will actually swim upside down. But in some cases, you cannot tell that the animals are deficient unless you do some kind of a biopsy or test some of the fish and look at internal organs. Going back then to Robinson and Lee, here we see the vitamin requirements, and this is from the 2015 version of this. And vitamin A and D are applied in international units per pound of feed, and everything else then is reported in ppm. So, and then they're showing here nicotinic acid and biotin, none are required. Well, actually, they are required, but particularly in the case of biotin, the quantity required is very low. And if you have any animal protein in the diet at all, it can basically supply all the biotin. And studies from Norway have shown that biotin is actually very stable through the production process. So if it's in the ingredients, it's almost guaranteed to be almost all there in the feed. Here we see a comparison for several fish species. So previously we saw channel catfish only, but now we have comparison here with rainbow trout, salmon, carp, and tilapia. And in the case of tilapia, it says not required. Well, obviously vitamins are required. So now we just looked at channel catfish alone. Let's look here. We see a comparison with channel catfish, rainbow trout, salmon, carp, and Nile tilapia. And R, as we see here, means it's required, but they don't know how much. And NR means not required. Well, that's inositol, which is a non-essential. And then if we look over here, we see NT, which means not tested. And so this was showing, coming from the NRC 1993, that by that time a lot of the vitamin requirements of tilapia had not yet been determined, but they're all known now. This was a paper from the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center. They published a lot of papers for use by the industry. This one from 1997, Refinement of Vitamin Supplementation in Diets for Pond-Raised Catfish. So we had a previously recommended supplementation. So this had come from earlier, and it also accounted a little bit for losses during feed manufacture. And then they had updated it. Now, many of the vitamins, in fact, have not been updated, but in this case, biotin, thiamine had been dropped, and pyridoxine had been increased, folic acid had been increased, and in some cases where they said none over here, or over here they had a requirement here, they basically were saying none. But in general, we will add even these vitamins that they declare that are not necessary simply because we put maybe a small amount in just as an insurance. Although if you're really desperate to keep feed costs down, you can skip it and you might not be able to see any significant difference. A moment ago, they talked about that you had to consider losses. Now, extrusion is a very aggressive feed manufacturing process. You have high moisture, you have high temperature, 120, 130 degrees in the barrel of the extruder. You have high pressure, sometimes maybe 5, 6, up to 10 or more atmospheres of pressure. And you have high shear going on in a single screw extruder. And some vitamins are quite stable and some vitamins are not. Looking at our list here, then we see that thiamine, they retained only 65%, and pyridoxine, they retained only 70%, but the pantothenic acid, the riboflavin, and basically the niacin were all recovered. And so when we are formulating our feeds, we have to take into account these losses. Very important that we do so. And previously I mentioned, the conditions that I thought were important. Down actually at the bottom here, if you take the trouble to read this, you'll see actually the conditions that they had. They had the temperature is in Fahrenheit, and they had the pressure and so on. And how it says 30 minutes. 30 minutes would not be extrusion time, but 30 minutes could include the conditioning chamber before extrusion, because the feed will go through the extruder less than a minute. Going back to Wilson's book, Mineral Deficiency Signs. So all of the minerals are required. Many of them are cofactors in various enzymes. As we understand, we need iron for hemoglobin, so the blood can carry oxygen. We need selenium for the selenoproteins and glutathione peroxidase, the various antioxidant enzymes that are in the body. Many of these other minerals are involved also with antioxidant enzymes, manganese, and then we have the macrominerals, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. These are all involved in bone and muscle function. Potassium also involved in muscle function. Robinson and Lee have given us this list of mineral requirements, and so then they say calcium, none. And usually there's enough calcium coming out of the feed ingredients, or also they can absorb it out of the water. And calcium is extremely difficult to control because the bone is where most of the calcium is stored in the body. And anytime there is a temporary let's say, inadequacy of calcium, the animal will simply pull some out of the bone and put it into circulation. Basically, very similar occurs with phosphorus. Now, the thing with phosphorus, they're giving us available phosphorus, 0.3 to 0.35. And they're very conscious of the fact that a lot of the phosphorus that's coming out of plant ingredients is actually bound up in phytic acid, and so therefore is not available. And before we had phytase enzyme, we relied on dicalcium or maybe monocalcium phosphates as a way to supplement the phosphorus. And then you see the other minerals that are required. Now, they're saying zinc is 200 ppm. Now, this is because their diet has a very high soy and cottonseed, both of which have quite high phytic acid levels. And phytic acid binds zinc very tightly, making it totally unavailable for absorption if the phytic acid manages to grab onto it. And so they're saying using zinc oxide. Well, I really do not agree with using zinc oxide. It's nearly indigestible. And so that would be another reason why they're recommending a very high level. If you were to use a chelated zinc, you could probably get away with much less, maybe 20 ppm or 30 ppm, because the Dr. Lovell at Auburn University showed that the efficacy of zinc methionine, so that's a amino acid chelated zinc, was about 400% more effective than even zinc sulfate, which is highly available, not like zinc oxide, which has very low solubility and very low digestibility. This paper now we have Delbert Gatlin and looking at protein and energy requirements. Looking at the feed protein and to energy ratio, two diets, same protein to energy ratio of 87.7 milligrams of protein per kilocalorie of energy per kilogram, basically, and then a 25% protein diet and a 35% protein diet. There you see the composition of the diets. And then fish were fed, the notes up here at the top, fish were fed 1 time per day at these different percent body weight quantities for 8 weeks. And then they had another treatment where they actually just starved the fish for 8 weeks. And so now we're looking in this axis at maximum growth rate. In this axis, we're looking on grams of protein per kilogram body weight. And this one, we're looking at energy, kilocalories per kilogram body weight. And you can see that the starved fish basically lost weight. And as the protein level increased to a point, then in terms of grams of protein intake per day, then beyond a certain protein intake, then the fish just simply were not able to utilize it. They didn't need it. They just basically are going to be excreting it out, or they're going to burn it for energy. So beyond a certain point, there wasn't really any reason to increase protein intake. And likewise, you increase the energy, you get a certain amount of growth, and then beyond a certain point, in the case of a high-fat diet, then the energy is going to be and protein are going to be quite imbalanced, which is going to cause problems. So here's the recommendation of Robinson and Lee on for protein content, same as before, amino acids there, but we come down here to the bottom, we see digestible energy, and we see lipids and carbohydrate. Available phosphorus for channel catfish, so this is quite important. Total phosphorus is not really the number we care about, because a lot of our plant ingredients have phosphorus that's biologically unavailable. It's bound up in phytic acid. and the phytic acid has to be treated with phytase enzymes, or if you use sprouted grains rather than dry whole grains, the phytic acid with sprouted grains is also reduced significantly, and then the phosphorus is biologically available. So here we're talking about available phosphorus requirements for food size channel catfish. And so on the table on the left-hand side, means for weight gain, feed conversion, and dressing yield of channel catfish fed all plant diet, so no animal protein at all. And you see the dietary available phosphorus on the far left, and you see the weight gain and the feed conversion and the dressing percentage. So when you get the uh, proper amount of available phosphorus, like let's say up here we see maximum is about 0.36, 0.44. Then above that, the growth rate goes down, and when you don't have enough, the growth rate is not so good. You get the best FCRs when you're in the sweet spot. So about 0.3 to 0.4, I think we saw that highlighted elsewhere. And then they looked at what happened in the fish when they were feeding these diets. So they looked at bone ash, they looked at bone phosphorus, and then bone breaking strength. So you can see that they also then, in this range here, they had the highest amount of phosphorus in the bone. And bone breaking strength didn't really seem to matter much once you met the more or less minimum recommended level. The more ash you added, it didn't decrease the bone strength. The bone strength actually increased. Okay, feeds and feeding. In the beginning, I showed you the production of catfish. Now, this one is the current status of feed production in the United States. And this is coming from this report that was published in July 2025 by the American Feed Industry Association. It was a report prepared by a consultant. And looking at catfish feed production in these 4 states: Mississippi, 140,000 metric tons; Alabama, 74,000 metric tons; Arkansas, 12,250 metric tons, and 10,000 for Texas. Now, if you're an American and you want to know pounds, then go and read the report, because this actually ends up as millions of pounds. But when you convert it into metric tons, which is larger than a standard short ton, then the numbers are much, much smaller. This now I'm showing you several pages or tables from this book. Once again, Tom Lovell's book. This is chapter 9 on feeding channel catfish, which was written by Dr. Robinson. Feed consumption and feed conversion ratios for different sizes of catfish at optimum temperature. So you see optimum temperature is typically in a range of about 28 to 30 degrees Celsius. And the different fish body weight from 27 grams up to 1.3 kilograms. Feed consumption as a percent of body weight goes down very considerably, and fish grow on a sigmoidal curve. So there's a point where as the fish reach a certain size, then the growth rate slows down. And in order to get them to grow larger than that size, then you have to feed them more feed, and they seem to use it less efficiently, and the feed conversion ratio goes up, as you can see here. When you get to 1 kilogram, the feed conversion ratio is 2 or higher. A moment ago, I said optimum temperature was 28 to 30. Well, here they're saying 28 to 31. And once again, we've got fish size from 60 pounds. So this is pounds. 1 pound is equal to 0.454 kilograms. You have feed consumption as a percent of body weight and the feed conversion ratios. This actually looks like the same data set that was in the slide a couple of slides ago. Now, we're talking here about winter temperature. So when temperature of the water is below 21 degrees Celsius. And the table shows us actually the Fahrenheit below 55 and then 55 to 70. And I've converted that for you into degrees Celsius. So when the water temperature is below 13 degrees Celsius, well, this is very low for a semi-tropical fish. And you see the percent of body weight for feeding schedule. It's very, very low. And then the feeding frequency is very limited. It's not daily. It's not multiple times per day. And 1 or 2 days per week. And weight gain is very low. In fact, they might not even be gaining weight, but if you don't feed them at all, they may in fact lose some weight, which is not what you want if you're trying to sell fish by their weight. So you want to at least get them to maintain their weight, and you accept that cost. And so you see the data there for fingerlings and then also for grow out. One of the things with fish in the winter is that because their entire metabolism slows down, their immunity slows down, and their feed intake slows down, but they often then have a much slower immunity and could actually benefit from more nutrients than they take in. So my preference in a winter diet is that I assume that they will have a lower intake, but I will actually make the feed more concentrated. So I would feed a higher protein and maybe do a better job of trying to improve fat absorption, change the oils that I use, and I might also increase some essential vitamins simply because they should have a high quantity, but they're eating much less. And if you don't raise the amounts in the feed, then the fish are going to be in a immune weak situation. We have this paper from 2010 by our authors Robinson and Lee. They are probably the most prolific authors dealing with anything to do with channel catfish nutrition. Here they're looking at size and feed conversion. Size, they've got the final weight, the days, then they've got the feed conversion ratios and survival and so on. And then they plot it more or less like this. So as the fish weight increases, the FCR is going to increase. Now, this every farmer will know. So then they have to, consider the cost of growing larger fish, which sometimes with the industry, as I understand it from some of the references that I've read, is that when the catfish get too large, then actually their selling price goes down. So it's actually not really very effective, unless the only reason you want large fish is if you're doing filleting of the fish. If you're selling whole round fish, then those large fish are actually penalizing you because the price that they sell for goes down. It's larger than what the market wants. Feeds and ingredients. Going then back to the paper that I started with by Robinson and Lee about feeds. So they say currently commercial feeds used for growing catfish to food size typically contain 28% protein. So the industry has standardized around that for grower feeds. Starter feeds might be 32. And then they give us the digestible energy at about 27 kilocalories per gram of protein digestible energy. And the feeds are almost all plant-based. So a lot of that has to do with the fact that the industry, as I mentioned in part one, is under extreme pressure for profitability, and the feeds are maybe 50-55% of the cost of production, but it's a big chunk and a small increase in the price of feed, which I'll get to at the very end here, has a big impact on their profitability. So they basically use the readily available plant ingredients that are coming from the region. So we have soybean meal, cottonseed meal, corn, gluten feed, or corn germ meal. Those are low-cost products. We've got some corn in there to produce a floating feed, and then some wheat middlings. Fat, a little bit. They've added some lysine, 0.4%. Now they've also added phytase enzymes, so that means they can probably avoid adding any supplemental phosphate, monocalcium, dicalcium phosphate, and then they have their vitamin and their trace minerals. I mentioned this publication that was commissioned by the American Feed Industry Association previously called Animal Feed Consumption. So this report was covering all forms of animal feed from livestock, poultry, horses, sheep, everything. And we're fortunate that it also included aquaculture species combined together. And it gives us not only production of animal feed by state, but it also gives us use of feed ingredients, because after all, we're talking about animal feed consumption. And part of the report is also looking at the circularity of the feed ingredients used from a sustainability point of view. In any case, let's look at this graph. So here we see 2023 aquaculture diet composition. So this is for all of the United States collectively. So we see corn related ingredients. So this is going to be corn, corn gluten feed, corn gluten meal, and then anything else that is coming from corn, and then soy related. So this would be soybean meal of low or high protein. It might involve some soy protein concentrate. It might involve some fermented soy or whatever. And then we have other plant-based meals. So this would be whole wheat and similar ingredients. Well, we'll have a list. We can actually look at the list when we go to the next couple of slides. And then processed plant co-products. So, for example, if they're producing cotton and they produce cottonseed oil, or they produce peanut oil, then they're going to have, or soybean oil, they're going to have, some other products that might be coming out of these streams. So, processed plant co-products, not sure what's all in there. Then we have animal byproducts. So this is going to be swine, bovine, and poultry, fats and oils, and then other feed ingredients. So this is going to be our vitamins, our minerals, our feed additives, our phosphate supplements, our amino acids, and so on. This is coming from page 135 of the report. And so here we have a breakdown of every single state in the United States and their use in animal feed of all of these ingredients. So I've highlighted with the arrows just simply the 4 states we're talking about that are the main producers of catfish feed. So we see, and note up here that this is reported as short tons. So short tons is 2,000 pounds, where a metric ton is 2,200 pounds. So we have then soybean meal, soybean oil, corn, corn DDGS, corn gluten meal, cottonseed meal, meat and bone meal, feather meal, okay, meat meal, blood meal, fish meal. And let's go and look at the second page. The table keeps going on. We have wheat middlings, wheat flour, poultry fat, soy protein concentrate, wheat gluten meal, lecithin, fish oil, and then other ingredients. And then the final column here is giving us the total of at least their estimation of the total amount of in short tons of ingredients that were used in these states. Looking at Mississippi, which is the largest feed producer in the United States, and producing nearly above 55% of the catfish feed in the United States. We see a lot of use of wheat middlings and then soy protein concentrate. That's probably, we have to keep in mind that even though Mississippi might be the largest feed producer, probably not 100% of the feed is going to catfish. Okay, let's jump back to the previous page. Once again, looking at Mississippi, the largest user of soybean meal, over 100,000 short tons, and corn, 41,000 short tons, and so on. So there you can see, and a very large user also of cottonseed meal, more than 52 tons, whereas it's really more than any other state is using. There's a series of tables here that I'm going to show you. These are all coming from this 2006 paper published by the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. So you'll see these tables. They're basically, what they're doing here is they're going through ingredients, feedstuffs used in commercial catfish feeds, soybean meal, cottonseed meal, peanut meal, fish meal, meat and bone meal, and so on. There's 4 or 5 of these pages here. They have some comments here, and you see the basic nutritional profile, including lysine and methionine and cysteine. We'll just run through these. If you want to see something, just download that document. You can see these tables in there, or just pause the screen and have a look as you want. Here they're giving you the maximum and minimums for the different nutrients that you would put into your least cost feed formulation program. And one thing to note here, they say cottonseed meal maximum is 15%. However, you can use more if you supplement lysine. And they're, at this time, 2006, they're not recommending using bovine products. It says down here at the bottom, bovine, non-fish animal protein. That could be feather meal, swine meal, poultry meal, but they were recommending beef because of mad cow disease, which I think by now the understanding of the industry about that is different. So I don't think they would have the same issue today as they had back then. And then they're also giving us maximum xanthophylls of 11 ppm, which is the amount that you need to stay below if you don't want to have yellow catfish flesh. Here's a diet from Robert Wilson's book from 1991, composition of a typical 32% crude protein extruded catfish feed. And it has to have a fairly high amount of corn in order to get the amount of starch that you need to expand it and make it float. And then they're mentioning here ascorbic acid, and they're using ethyl cellulose coated. This is basically a product that no one would use today in aquaculture feed. We would use some kind of a stable vitamin C based on an ascorbate to phosphate, of which maybe Stacy from DSM is the best known product, but there's other mainstream producers, and certainly a lot of producers in China and up-and-coming producers in India. Off on the left here, we just show you some pictures from his book, showing the way that most of the catfish farmers feed. And so they have a large bin that they load from an overhead silo. They've had a feed delivered to their farm with a bulk truck, stored in the silo. They load this hopper and they drive around on the banks or the levees of the pond full circumference of the pond, and they blow the feed out. You can see here in this picture that the feed is hitting the water, and this will be on some kind of a schedule, and actually probably the fish are waiting to eat. Here's a paper feeding catfish in commercial ponds. In this case, they're giving us 28% protein here and 32% protein here. Several examples of the formula. The third one here has only 22% soybean meal, but it's very high in cottonseed meal, more than double the others. But note, as we saw in the previous slide, you can go above 15% if you supplement with additional lysine, which is included here. This is from from Tom Lovell's book. So examples of typical catfish fry and fingerling feeds. And so in this case, 50% protein for fry, 35% for fingerling. And then you're going to maybe go to a 32 for first grower, and then maybe a 28% for a second grower and a finisher feed if you choose to use those. Of course, the formulas can change because pellet sizes will need to be changed. And so anyway, there you see everything. Now, notice that in the fry feed, which is very high protein due to the fact that sometimes small fish do not have a fully developed digestive system, they've left out the cottonseed meal because maybe the anti-nutritional factors would be interfere with the growth. Here, once again, from that paper, plant-based catfish feeds, ingredient specification. So this is for least cost formulation, the ingredients and the maximum minimums amounts. And then below that, the minimum nutrient specifications that you would set up in your program to make a 28% least cost catfish feed. A 1994 report called Feeding Catfish from Mississippi State. Here, once again, we have 32 and 28. This is actually the same table that we saw a few slides ago. But over here on the right-hand side now, they're talking about a winter feed and a feed medicated with Romet. Now, Romet was the only approved medication drug that was allowed to be used in approved for use, registered for use in fish feeds in the United States. There may be more now. But the reason that this product was developed was to fight the very common problem that catfish farmers have in the winter with a bacterial infection from Edwardsella. And so here we see the standard feed if you're not having a problem with Edwardsella, 25% protein, slow sink. Slow sinking, that implies that it's an extruded feed. It has 35% corn in it, which is certainly more than enough to make something float. And then the medicated feed has 32%. Now, it's curious that down here in the comments, it says that the fish meal needs to be at 16%, not lower than that. And I suspect that's because the Romat, which is added into the feed for combating the Edwardsella, actually is an antibiotic combination. It probably has a very bad taste, and it affects feed intake. So they have fish meal in there, which is a readily available product. No fancy feed additives like hydrolysates or anything, in order to make the feed still taste good for the fish and to compensate for the bad taste of the Romet. Here we have some more information about feedstuffs. In this case, I put this one here because we have a very similar list of ingredients. But what I find interesting is they're now giving us available total lysine in the product, available lysine, which is very important. We need to have minimum digestible lysine, available lysine. They also give us the available methionine. And then they also have an estimation of the feed levels of xanthophylls, so that if we were to try to formulate feeds with less than 11 ppm of xanthophylls to avoid coloration of catfish flesh, we would be paying attention to this, and we would put that into our feed formulation program as well. I'm highlighting this one paper because they're talking specifically about cottonseed meal. Now, cottonseed meal has several unique anti-nutritional factors that are not common, and the main one we're talking about here is gossypol. So we have bound gossypol, and then we have free gossypol, which is the one we're concerned about. So free gossypol interferes with lysine availability, lysine metabolism, and it also affects iron. It binds to iron. And so if we look at their test diets, we've got soybean meal going down and cottonseed meal coming up. So 0, 27.5%, and 55%. And note in the diets that contain the cottonseed meal, they also have supplemental lysine because the cottonseed meal interferes with lysine. And then we see the different amounts of cottonseed in the diet. We see the amounts of supplemental lysine in the diet. And then they're giving us the data about weight gain, feed intake, feed efficiency ratio, protein efficiency ratio, apparent protein utilization. And due to the presence of the lysine and so on, we still are able to maintain a high protein efficiency ratio and a high apparent protein utilization. Whereas if we had a diet without supplement, it's unfortunate. I would have actually had a diet with cottonseed without any supplemental lysine, kind of like as a negative control, which they do not have here. So we can't see the negative effect. But definitely, if we had a diet with cottonseed meal, but we weren't supplementing lysine, we would see a reduced protein utilization. Ingredient digestibility. Going back to this report, here we have then a lot of common ingredients for catfish feeds. And the international feed number, these were popular back in the day, but people don't pay much attention to that anymore. And here we're dealing with apparent digestibility. So apparent digestibility means that we are looking at what nutrient, how much goes in. We're looking at the same nutrient, how much comes out. And we are using a marker such as chromic oxide to see the overall loss of the quantity. And then based on that, then we can calculate an apparent digestibility. But it is not a true digestibility because we're not factoring in the amount of nitrogen, say, for example, and protein and so on that is being lost through respiration, through feces, through the gills, or through urine. And I have one slide here at the end of this set where we show you some data coming from Robert Wilson, which is true. That is that he's done this in some kind of a chamber where he's tracking every single um, excretory product, whether it's coming from the feces, coming from the gills, or coming from the urine. So this is from a book called Nutrient Requirements and Feeding of Fish for Aquaculture by, it was edited by Carl Webster and Chorn Lim. And here we're basically looking at average apparent amino acid availabilities. The previous slide was just looking at the main nutrients, where here I brought this one in to show you the amino acid availability. And This is similar data for similar ingredients, looking at the essential amino acids, looking at digestibility of alternative protein-rich feedstuffs. So alternative, we're basically talking about not fish meal. And although they do have fish and shrimp offal meal here, so that's essentially fisheries byproduct meal. So, for example, if we're talking today about certification, sustainability certification programs such as best aquaculture practices or uh, aquaculture certification, um, um, we oftentimes have fish in, fish out ratios. They're telling us how much pure fish meal we can use. And in order to meet a minimum or a maximum for fish in, fish out ratio, we can then fall back on byproducts. So these are dealing with byproducts rather than special cod fish meal. So we've got our canola meal, corn gluten feed. We have then hydrolyzed feather meal, which doesn't have a very suitable amino acid profile, but it's high protein, and small quantities can be used. And then they're giving us the protein digestibility. For example, of the feather meal, they're saying that it's almost 90%. But you have to be very careful about how the feather meal is produced, whether it's acid hydrolyzed or whether it's hydrolyzed with enzymes. That does make a difference. This is a relatively recent paper, 2011. And this is actually the only one that I have that's not coming from America. This is coming from Brazil. And so here we see their apparent amino acid um, digestibility coefficients, and they're using very similar ingredients. Now, you can go and compare these different tables and see. I would recommend reading the paper because then you can read their methodology and see how they determined it, what kind of a marker they were using, and what their procedures were. If their numbers are significantly different than the Americans, I wouldn't really think so. Um, After all, it is a peer-reviewed paper. But that's something that I decided I would share this with you simply because it's not from America. And if we're talking about nutrient availability, very careful. We need to be looking at phosphorus for a couple of reasons. One, we want to minimize phosphorus excretion. We want to minimize phosphorus in the effluent because this promotes eutrophication and downgrades water quality, provides nutrients for algae when we want to try to avoid blooms. And so this is then telling us the apparent availability of the phosphorus in a number of different uh, phosphorus sources, the phosphates, and then also phosphorus availability in some key ingredients. This is coming from a book by Tucker and Robinson called Channel Catfish Farming. If you don't have institutional access, you're going to have to buy this book from Amazon or somebody else if you want to read it. Available phosphorus for channel catfish. Here, this paper from 2000. This was done at Texas A&M under the supervision of Deborah Gatlin. This was like a PhD student's paper. We have the nutrient profile of the main ingredients that were used. We have the diets that were used, and then the apparent availability of the nutrients. And they're looking at the soluble reactive phosphorus. So this is readily available, and where TP means total phosphorus. So the difference between these two is the amount that is not available. Now, we could use phytase enzyme, and if we use phytase enzyme, then these numbers would be probably higher. because then we're going to be getting some of the phosphorus released by the phytic acid from the use of the phytase enzyme. Okay, as I complete the section on nutrient digestibility, we have this one from Robert Wilson where he's looking at true amino acid digestibility. So I mentioned to you that true means that they're looking at all sources of excretion in the water, from the gills, from the urine, and then from the feces when they do this calculation. It's not very commonly done because it's quite a bothersome procedure to handle all of those other sources. And most of the industry is used to using a parent anyway, and they just kind of accommodate that there's going to be some uh, maybe available overestimates a little bit because we're not looking at all of the excretory areas. So I'm ready to conclude my part about the United States and channel catfish farming in the United States. So here, finally, I have a couple of slides on the profitability of catfish production. Now, I asked an AI to give me details about catfish production and feed prices and sale of fish in the main states that are producing catfish. And so then it gave me a number of references. So I've gone to some of these online websites. One was the Alabama State Extension, and then Mississippi University State University Extension. So some of the key points here was it said in 2023, according to Alabama here, that the premium price was $1.24, but if the fish were oversized, then they lost about 12 cents per pound, and the price dropped to about $1.10 per pound. And 10% of the processed fish, because the fish are, in most cases, are being grown with mixed age classes in ponds, there's always going to be some oversize. And that amounted to a loss of about 7 million US dollars in Alabama in 2023. Then, interestingly, we have the feed prices. So they talk about 28% protein feed was $532 a ton, and 32% protein was $563 a ton. And this represented a 45 to 50% increase in the price of feed over the past 3 years. Now, I mentioned, I believe, in part one that the feed cost was approximately 50% of the total cost of production in the United States. And so when you have a rise in feed cost, then that has a very serious impact on the profitability of the farms. Now, this year, 2025, we've had this trade war going on between United States and China. And one of the consequences of the tariff wars was that China stopped buying U.S. soybean meal and bought from Brazil instead. And so then that basically has brought the domestic price of soybean meal in the United States down a lot. So maybe this year, then the feed prices have been able to drop. Looking then here at Mississippi, so Ganesh Kumar, he's written a lot of these papers that I mentioned, certainly in part one, with writing with Carolyn Engel. But he is with the Mississippi government. And then he said the cost of catfish production ranges from $1.12 to $1.30 per pound. And producers are receiving $1.10 to $1.15. So they're basically almost losing money. He does mention the fact that big farms have an advantage over small farms. Small farms don't have scale to help them to control their costs. And so a lot of small farms are suffering more. And then he says here in Mississippi that feed prices have stabilized at $4.75 for 32% protein. And this was down about 10% from the year before. So he's talking about 2024. So what we could see here was that if we look at both of these together, that feed prices in 2023 were up and feed prices in 2024 were down from 2023. Moving now over to more data that I got from the recommended from the AI, looking here at Texas A&M. They're quoting in this website Dr. Todd Sink, and he's an associate professor at Texas A&M. He said that the feed farm gate price of catfish had fluctuated between 80 cents and $1.20 per pound over the last 25 years. Well, probably it's closer to 120 today. And then he said in 2025, catfish feed prices more than doubled from $250 per ton in 1996. So keep that in mind that in 1996, the feed price was half that of today. And yet the price of catfish has, say, risen from 80 baht to 100 or 80 cents. Excuse me, I said baht because I'm in Thailand. Between 80 cents and $1.20. So the feed price has increased about 50%, but the feed price has more than doubled. And then he says in Texas, producers are earning about $1.16 per pound, and production costs range from 98 cents to $1.03. So there was a small margin there, very little profit margin. And in order to make a profit, the farm has to be producing continuously, and the profit per pound is very low, so they have to produce a lot of volume in order to try to make their projected revenue. Okay, so to conclude here, then let's go back and look at something from that paper that I started out with from Robinson and Lee. At the end of this paper, in their conclusion, they said that what the future holds for catfish nutrition research is uncertain. However, in our opinion, it is unlikely that any major breakthroughs will be made in the foreseeable future. This may seem overly pessimistic, but our appraisal seems realistic, noting that there are currently few affordable nutritious feedstuffs available for use in catfish feeds. In the long term, this may change, but until then, the industry continues to be dependent on traditional crops. We know what they are: corn, soy, cottonseed, peanut, wheat, middlings, and those are really mostly the cheapest ingredients that they have, and they're unable to use anything more expensive than that. And well, there are some breakthroughs. I recently recorded a video on DDGS. DDGS from U.S. corn is much better than it used to be, and now they've introduced some corn fermented protein, which has a higher protein content, highly digestible, high available phosphorus. And this may be see some of this coming into commercial catfish feed in the future. But nevertheless, there are many other factors that affect the cost of feed, and as long as the price of the fish does not increase, then it's going to be very difficult for the catfish farmers to make money. If the catfish feed market is stable or static, then there's not much interest in investing more money in catfish nutrition research. So that's basically the conclusion of all of this. I would like then to just bring up China, because we did mention in part one that China was producing some considerable quantities and exporting, let's say, in the vicinity of 100,000 tons, mainly to America. And so I asked DeepSeek, which is the Chinese AI, and it reads and understands Chinese very well, where most of the Western AI agents do not. And so it goes through all of the Chinese media and the stock reports and the annual reports from different companies, and then research university reports and so on, and it comes up with this. So we have here then a commercial feed formula for channel catfish in China. Fish meal, high quality, 5 to 10%. Soybean meal, 25 to 35%. Rapeseed meal. They don't have cottonseed meal, but they have a lot of rapeseed in China, and some canola. We have corn, wheat flour, rice bran, poultry, fish oil, soy oil, and vitamins, and so on. And then in the box on the right-hand side, key considerations in Chinese catfish feed, alternative proteins due to rising fish meal prices. Although currently the price of fish meal is been coming down, um, which is a disincentive to investigate alternatives. Nevertheless, the Chinese feed mills are increasingly using poultry byproducts, fermented soybean meal, and also insect meal. Now, insect meal is just at this point, it's more like a novel ingredient. We don't have it in the quantities and at the price we need it to be. Most of the feeds in China for catfish are floating pellets, and there's a lot of research in looking at different feed additives. When I asked for something about the feed formulations, they have a high protein feed formula, fish meal, soy, wheat flour, yeast extract. So that could be dried brewer's yeast, or maybe a purified yeast product like autolyzed yeast, I don't know. Then we have some added methionine there, and then a formula for broodstock feed for breeding catfish, which tends to be a little bit higher quality feed. And so that is the end of my presentation of my information. So as I usually do at the end of my talks, I'm going to give you some resources that you can go and look for and download in some cases in order to gain more knowledge about catfish nutrition in the United States. First, we have this paper published in 2007. This one is coming from one of the universities, the experiment station. Then we have this book, two editions by Dr. Alan Davis at Auburn University, Feed and Feeding Practices in Aquaculture, and Feed and Feeding Practices, second edition. This one just came out in 2022, so it's quite new. And then we have a little bit older here. This one by Robert Wilson, I don't have the date on it, but that was 1991. We have Webster and Lim's book in 2002. And then this was coming from the Mississippi Extension. And this is Composition and Formulation of Channel Catfish Feeds from 2012. This is a very interesting document, a lot of information about open feed formulas. I mentioned Dr. Tom Lovell's book. This is the QR code for the first edition, which I think if you scan that, you can actually find it downloadable. It's available pretty all over the internet. Here we have the 1993 requirements from the National Research Council. This one was the second or third one that came out, and not the most recent one. And so as the editions get newer and newer, the ability to dig out the catfish nutrition data gets buried deeper and deeper. So this old one is actually still pretty good on channel catfish. And I give you the QR codes for the newer ones early on in the presentation. And then we have this one from Mississippi State University, A Practical Guide to Nutrition Feeds and Feeding of Catfish from 2021. So that's a really good reference to look at. And then there's a few websites that I really recommend you can go and look at. One is the Southern Regional Aquaculture Center. There's the QR code. And if you go there, you can find all kinds of papers. If you search for catfish fact sheets, These are 4 here that are all available at this website. You can go and use this top QR code here to take you to the page, and these will all be listed, and you can look through. There's many more than just these 4. And then another website is this one, which is basically those 4 probably are coming from, a list looks something similar to this. You can go and see the entire list. Another one interesting website is the Journal of the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And if you search, this will open a page that you can search for catfish feed. And then all of these papers were there. And if you note down here at the bottom, it says you can download a PDF of all of these if you want. So there's more there, but note here we have focusing on ingredients: cottonseed meal, rice bran, and so on. If we go to Mississippi State University and search for catfish at that QR code, then we can find a number of publications there, including this one from 1994 on catfish feed manufacture. So this is good if you're interested in manufacturing. It's showing you production equipment, how to set up the lines, and what something about the specifications of the equipment. It's from my point of view, it's a quite a useful document, and it's written for non-engineers. We have this one, 1994, feeding catfish, and then this one from 2013, comparative quality of foodstuffs for catfish feed. So that one is giving you a lot of information about ingredients. So there we are at the end. I'm here on YouTube, of course. You can also find me on X and also on LinkedIn. LinkedIn, I'm by my name. X, I'm by Fish Nutrition Expert. Please visit those YouTube here, subscribe, and X and LinkedIn, you can subscribe over there too to get notified when I release new material. Please like, comment, turn on your notifications, and share my information, particularly if you're a student. I'd very much appreciate this going everywhere. So thank you very much.